Chapter 7. One day at Yuletide, Simon Anderson came riding to Jorungard, a quite unlooked-for guest. He craved pardon for coming thus, unbidden and alone, without his kinfolk. But Sir Andres was in Sweden on the king's business. He himself had been at home at Differen for a time, but only his young sisters and his mother, who lay ill abed, were there. So time had hung on his hands, and a great longing had taken him to look in upon them up here. Ranfrid and Lavrans thanked him much for having made this long journey in the depth of winter. The more they saw of Simon, the more they liked him. He knew of all that had passed between Andres and Lavrans, and it was now fixed that his and Kristin's betrothal ale should be drunk before the beginning of Lent, if Sir Andres could be home by that time, but, if not, then as soon as Easter was past. Kristin was quiet and downcast when with her betrothed. She found not much to talk of with him. One evening, when they had all been sitting drinking, he asked her to go out with him a little into the cool. Then, as they stood on the balcony in front of the upper hall, he put his arm about her waist and kissed her. After that he did the same often when they were alone. It gave her no gladness, but she suffered him to do it, since she knew the betrothal was a thing that must come. She thought of her wedding now only as something which she must go through with, not as something she wished for. None the less she liked Simon well enough, most though when he talked with others and did not touch or talk to her. She had been so unhappy through this whole autumn. It was of no use, however often she told herself Benteen had been able to do her no harm. None the less, she felt herself soiled and shamed. Nothing could be the same as it had been before, since a man had tried to wreak such a will on her. She lay awake of nights and burned with shame, and could not stop thinking of it. She felt Benteen's body close against hers, as when they fought, his hot, beery breath. She could not help thinking of what might have happened, and she thought with a shudder through all her body of what he had said, how Arne would get the blame, if it could not be hidden. There rushed through her mind all that would have followed if such a calamity had befallen, and then folk had heard of her meeting with Arne. What if her father and mother had believed such a thing of Arne, and Arne himself? She saw him as she had seen him that last evening, and she felt as though she sank crushed before him at the very thought that she might have dragged him down with her into sorrow and disgrace. And then she had such ugly dreams. She had heard tell in church and in holy stories of fleshly lusts and the temptations of the body, but they had meant naught to her. Now it was become real to her that she herself and all mankind had a sinful carnal body which enmeshed the soul and ate into it with hard bonds. Then she would think out for herself how she might have killed or blinded Benteen. It was the only solace she could find, to sate herself with dreams of revenge upon the dark, hateful man who stood always in the way of her thoughts. But this did not help for long. She lay by Ulfhild's side of nights and wept bitter tears at the thought of all this that had been brought upon her by brute force. Benteen had not failed altogether. He had wrought scathe to the maidenhood of her spirit. The first work-day after Christmas, all the women on Jorungard were busy in the kitchen-house. Ranfrid and Kristin had been there too for most of the day. Late in the evening, while some of the women were clearing up after the baking, and others making ready for the supper, the dairymaid came rushing in, shrieking and wringing her hands. Jesus, Jesus, did ever any hear such a dreadful thing? They are bringing Aunt Gertsen home, dead on a sleigh. God help Gerd and Inga in this misery." A man who had dwelt in a cottage a little way down the road came in with Halvdan. It was these two who had met the beer. The women crowded round them. Outside the circle stood Kristin, white and shaking. Halvdan, Lavran's own body servant, who had known Arn from his boyhood, wept aloud as he told the story. It was Benteen, priest's son, who had killed Arn. On New Year's Eve the men of the bishop's household were sitting and drinking in the men's hall, and Benteen had come in. He had been given a clerkship now with the Corpus Christi prebendary. The men did not want him among them at first, but he had put Arn in mind that they were both from the same parish, and Arn had let him sit by him, and they had drunk together. But presently they had quarrelled and fought, and Arn had fallen on so fiercely that Benteen had snatched a knife from the table and stabbed him in the throat, and then more than once in the breast. Arn had died almost at once. The bishop had taken this mischance much to heart. He himself had cared for the laying out of the corpse, and had it brought all the long way home by his own folk. Benteen he had thrown into irons, cast him out from the church, and if he were not already hanged, he was going to be. Halvdan had to tell all this over again many times as fresh people streamed in. Lavrans and Simon came over to the kitchen too when they marked all the stir and commotion about the place. Lavrans was much moved. He bade them saddle his horse. He would ride over to Brecon at once. As he was about to go, his eyes fell on Kristin's white face. "Maybe you would like to go with me?" he asked. Kristin faltered a little. She shuddered, but then she nodded, for she could not utter one word. "Is it not too cold for her?" said Ranfrid. "Doubtless they will have the wake tomorrow, and then 'tis like we shall all go together." Lavrans looked at his wife. He marked Simon's face too, and then he went and laid his arm round Kristin's shoulders. "She is his foster sister, you must bear in mind," said he. "Maybe she would like to help Inga with the laying out of the body." And though Kristin's heart was benumbed with despair and fear, she felt a glow of thankfulness to her father for his words. Ranfrid said then that if Kristin was to go, they must eat their evening porridge before they started. She wished, too, to send gifts to Inga by them, a new linen sheet, wax candles and fresh baked bread, and she bade them say she would come up herself and help to prepare for the burial. There was little eating, but much talking in the room while the food was on the table. One reminded the other of the trials that God had laid upon Gerd and Inga. Their farm had been laid waste by stone slips and floods. More than one of their elder children were dead, so that all Arn's brothers and sisters were still but little ones. They had had fortune with them now for some years, since the bishop placed Gerd at Finnsbreckum as his bailiff, and the children who were left to them were fair and full of promise. But his mother loved Arn more than all the rest. They pitied Sigrid Undset too. The priest was beloved and well respected, and the folk of the parish were proud of him. He was learned and skilled in his office, and in all the years he had had their church he had never let a holy day or a mass or a service pass that he was in duty bound to hold. In his youth he had been man-at-arms under Count Alv of Tornberg, but he had had the misfortune to kill a man of very high birth, and so had taken refuge with the Bishop of Oslo. When the bishop saw what a turn Eirik had for book-learning, he had him trained for a priest, and had it not been that he still had enemies by reason of that slaying of long ago, it was like Sigrid Undset would not have stayed here in this little charge. True enough, he was very greedy of pence, both for his own purse and for the church, but then, was not his church richly fitted out with plate and vestments and books? And he himself had these children, and he had had naught but sorrow and trouble with his family. In these far-away country parishes, folk held it was not reason that priests should live like monks, for they must at least have women to help them on their farms, and they might well need a woman to look after things for them, seeing what long and toilsome journeys they must make round the parishes, and that too in all kinds of weather. Besides, folk had not forgotten that it was not so very long ago priests in Norway had been wedded men. Thus no one had blamed Sire Eirik overmuch that he had had 3 children by the woman who tended his house while he was yet young. But this evening, they said, it looked indeed as though 'twas God's will to punish Eirik for his loose living. So much evil had his children and his children's children brought upon him. And some thought there was good reason, too, that a priest should have neither wife nor children. For after this it was much to be feared that bitterness and enmity would arise between the priest and the folk on Finnsbrecken, who until now had been the best of friends. Simon Andersen knew much of Bentine's doings in Oslo, and he told of them. Bentine had been clerk to the Dean of the Church of the Holy Virgin, and he had the name of being a quick-witted youth. There were many women, too, who liked him well. He had roving eyes and a glib tongue. Some held him a comely man. These were, for the most part, such women as thought they had a bad bargain in their husbands. And then young maids, the sort that liked well that men should be somewhat free with them. Simon laughed. Aye, they understood. Well, Bentine was so sly, he never went too far with that kind of woman. He was all talk with them, and so he got a name for clean living. But the thing was that King Hakon, as they knew, was a good and pious man himself, and fain would keep order among his men, and hold them to a seemly walk and conversation. The young ones, at least. The others were apt to be too much for him. And it came about that whatever pranks the youngsters managed to slip out and take part in, drinking bouts and gambling and beer drinking and such like, the priest of the king's household always got to hear of, and the madcaps had to confess and pay scot and suffer hard reproof. 2 or 3 of the wildest youths of all were hunted away, but at last it came out. It was this fox, Bentine's secretarius. Unknown to anyone, he had been made free of all the beer-houses, and worse places still. He confessed the serving wenches, and gave them absolution. Kristin sat at her mother's side. She tried to eat so that no one should mark how it was with her, though her hand shook so that she spilled the milk porridge at each spoonful, and her tongue felt so thick and dry in her mouth that she could not swallow the morsels of bread. But when Simon began to tell of Bentine, she had to give up making believe to eat. She held on to the bench beneath her. Terror and loathing seized her, so that she felt dizzy and sick. It was he who had wanted to. Bentine and Arne. Bentine and Arne. Beside herself with impatience, she waited for them to be finished. She longed to see Arne's comely face, to throw herself down beside him and mourn and forget all else. As her mother helped her with her outer wrappings, she kissed her daughter on the cheek. Kristin was so little used to endearments from her mother now, it comforted her much. She laid her head upon Ranfrid's shoulder a moment, but she could not weep. When they came out into the courtyard, she saw that others were going with them. Halvdan, John from Logabru, and Simon and his man. It gave her a pang, she knew not why, that the 2 strangers should be coming with them. It was a bitter cold evening, and the snow crackled underfoot. In the black sky the stars crowded thick, glittering like rime. When they had ridden a little way, they heard yells and howls and furious hoofbeats from the flats to the south. A little farther up the road, a whole troop of horsemen came tearing up behind and swept past them with a ringing of metal, leaving behind a vapour of reeking, rime-covered horseflesh which reached them even when they stood aside in the deep snow. Halvdan hailed the wild crew. They were youths from the farms in the south of the parish. They were still keeping Yuletide and were out trying their horses. Some, who were too drunk to understand, thundered on at a gallop, roaring at the tops of their voices and hammering on their shields. But a few grasped the tiding which Halvdan shouted to them. They fell out of the troop, grew silent, joined Lavran's company, and talked in whispers to those in the rear. At last they came in sight of Finnsbrecken, on the hillside beyond the Sill River. There were lights about the houses. In the middle of the courtyard, pine-root torches had been planted in a heap of snow, and their glare lay red over the white slopes, but the black houses looked as though smeared with clotted blood. One of Arne's little sisters stood outside and stamped her feet. She hugged her hands beneath her cloak. Kristin kissed the tear-stained, half-frozen child. Her heart was heavy as stone, and it seemed as though she had lead in her limbs as she climbed the stairs to the loft room where they had laid him. The sound of singing and the glitter of many lighted candles met them in the doorway. In the middle of the room stood the coffin he had been brought home in, covered with a sheet. Boards had been laid on trestles and the coffin placed upon them. At the head of the bier a young priest stood with a book in his hands, chanting. Round about knelt the mourners with their faces hidden in their heavy cloaks. Lavrans lit his candle at one of those already burning, set it firmly upon one of the boards of the bier, and knelt down. Kristin tried to do the like, but could not get her candle to stand. So Simon took it and helped her. As long as the priest went on chanting, all stayed upon their knees and repeated his words in whispers, their breath hanging like steam about their mouths in the bitter, cold air of the room. When the priest shut his book and the folk rose, there were many gathered in the death chamber already, Lavrans went forward to Inga. She stared at Kristin and seemed scarce to hear what Lavrans said. She stood holding the gifts he had handed to her, as though she knew not she had aught in her hand. "Are you come too, Kristin?" she said in a strange, choking voice. "Maybe you should see my son, so as he is come back to me." She pushed some of the candles aside, seized Kristin's arm with a shaking hand, and with the other swept the napkin from the face of the dead. It was greyish-yellow like clay, and the lips had the hue of lead. They had parted a little, so that the small, even, bone-white teeth showed through, as in a mocking smile. Under the long eyelashes there was a gleam of the glassy eyes, and there were some livid stains below the temples, either marks of blows or the death spots. "Maybe you would kiss him?" asked Inga as before. And Kristin bent forward at her bidding, and pressed her lips upon the dead man's cheek. It was clammy as with dew, and she thought she could feel the least breath of decay. The body had begun to thaw, perhaps, with the heat from all the tapers round. Kristin stayed still, lying with her hands on the bier, for she could not rise. Inga drew the shroud farther aside, so that the great gash above the collarbone came to sight. Then she turned toward the people and said with a shaking voice, "They lie, I see, who say a dead man's wound will bleed when he is touched by him who wrought his death. He is colder now, my boy, and less comely than when you met him last down there upon the road. You care not much to kiss him now, I see, but I have heard you scorned not his lips then." "Inga," said Lavrans, coming forward, "have you lost your wits? Are you raving?" "Oh, aye! You are all so fine down at Jorengard. You were far too rich a man, you, Lavrans Bjorgelson, for my son to dare think of courting your daughter with honour. And Kristin, too, she thought herself too good. But she was not too good to run after him on the highway at night and play with him in the thickets the night he left. Ask her yourself, and we will see if she dares deny it here, with Arne lying dead, and all through her lightness." Lavrans did not ask. He turned to Gerd. "Curb your wife, man. You see she has clean lost her wits." But Kristin lifted her white face and looked desperately about her. "I went and met Arne the last evening because he begged me to. But naught of wrong passed between us." And then, as she seemed to come to herself and to understand all, she cried out, "I know not what you mean, Inga. Would you slander Arne, and he lying here? Never did he tempt me, nor lure me astray." But Inga laughed aloud. Nay, not Arne, but Benteen priest. He did not let you play with him so. Ask Gunhild Lavrans, that washed the dirt off your daughter's back. And ask each man who was in the bishop's henchman's hall on New Year's Eve, when Benteen flouted Arne for that he had let her go, and leave him standing like a fool. She let Benteen walk homeward with her under her cloak, and would have played the same game with him. Lavrans took her by the shoulder and laid his hand over her mouth. Take her away, Gerd. Shameful it is that you should speak such words by this good youth's body. But if all your children lay here dead, I would not stand and hear you lie about mine. You, Gerd, must answer for what this mad woman says. Gerd took hold of his wife and tried to lead her away. But he said to Lavrans, "'Tis true, though. 'Twas of Kristin they talked, Arne and Benteen, when my son lost his life. Like enough you have not heard it, but there hath been talk in the parish here too this autumn." Simon struck a blow with his sword upon the clothes chest beside him. "Nay, good folk, now must you find somewhat else to talk of in this death chamber than my betrothed. Priest, can you not rule these folk and keep seemly order here?" The priest, Kristin saw now he was the youngest son from Ulsvolden, who had been home at Yule, opened his book and stood up beside the bier. But Lavrans shouted that those who had talked about his daughter, let them be who they might, should be made to swallow their words. And Inga shrieked, "Aye, take my life then, Lavrans, since she has taken all my comfort and joy, and make her wedding with this knight's son. Yet do all folk know that she was wed with Benteen upon the highway. Here!" And she cast the sheet Lavrans had given her right across the bier to Kristin. "I need not Ranfrid's linen to lay my Arne in the grave. Make headcloths of it, you, or keep it to swaddle your roadside brat, and go down and help Gunhild to moan for the man that's hanged." Lavrans, Gerd and the priest took hold of Inga. Simon tried to lift Kristin, who was lying over the bier, but she thrust his arm fiercely aside, drew herself up straight upon her knees, and cried aloud, "So God, my Saviour, help me, it is false!" And stretching out one hand, she held it over the nearest candle on the bier. It seemed as if the flame bent and waved aside. Kristin felt all eyes fixed upon her. What seemed to her a long time went by, and then all at once she grew aware of a burning pain in her arm, and with a piercing cry she fell back upon the floor. She thought herself she had swooned, but she was aware that Simon and the priest raised her. Inga shrieked out something. She saw her father's horror-stricken face and heard the priest shout that no one must take account of this ordeal. Not thus might one call God to witness. And then Simon bore her from the room and down the stairs. Simon's man ran to the stable, and soon after Kristin was sitting, still half senseless, in front of Simon on his saddle, wrapped in his cloak, and he was riding toward Jorungard as fast as his horse could gallop. They were nigh to Jorungard when Lavrans came up with them. The rest of their company came thundering along the road far behind. "Say naught to your mother," said Simon, as he set her down at the door of the house. "We have heard all too much wild talk tonight. 'Tis no wonder you lost your wits yourself at the last." Ranfrid was lying awake when they came in, and she asked how things had been in the wake chamber. Simon took it upon himself to answer for all. There had been many candles and many folk. There had been a priest, Tormod from Ulsvolden. Sira Eirik, he heard, had ridden off to Hamar this very evening, so there would be no trouble about the burial. "We must have a mass said over the lad," said Ranfrid. "God strengthen Inga. The good worthy woman is sorely tried." Lavrans sang the same tune as Simon, and in a little Simon said that now they must all go to rest, for Kristin is both weary and sorrowful. After a time, when Ranfrid slept, Lavrans threw on a few clothes and went and sat down on the edge of his daughter's bed. He found Kristin's hand in the dark and said very gently, "Now, you must tell me, child, what is true and what is false in all this talk Inga is spreading." Sobbing, Kristin told him all that had happened the evening Arn had set out for Hamar. Lavrans said nothing. Kristin crept toward him in her bed, threw her arms around his neck, and wailed softly, "It is my fault that Arn is dead. 'Tis but too true what Inga said." "It was Arn himself that begged you to go and meet him," said Lavrans, pulling the coverlid up over his daughter's bare shoulders. "I see now it was heedless in me to let you two go about together. But I thought the lad would have known better. I will not blame you two. I know these things are heavy for you to bear. Yet I never thought that a daughter of mine would fall into ill fame in this parish. And it will go hard with your mother when she hears these tidings. But that you went to Gunhild with this and not to me, that was so witless a thing. I don't understand how you could behave so foolishly. I cannot bear to stay here in the dale any more," sobbed Kristin. "Not a soul can I dare look in the face, and all I have brought upon them, the folks at Romangard and at Finnsbrecken." "Yes, they will have to see to it, both Gerd and Sira Eirik," said Lavrans, "that these lies about you are buried with Arn. For the rest, it is Simon Anderson that can best defend you in this business," he said, and patted her in the dark. "Don't you think he took the matter well and wisely?" "Father," and Kristin clung close to him and begged piteously and fervently, "send me to the convent, Father. Listen to me. I have thought of this for a long time. Maybe Ulfhild will grow well if I go in her stead. You know the shoes with beads upon them that I sewed for her in the autumn? I pricked my fingers sorely, and my hands bled from the sharp gold thread. Yet I sat and sewed on them, for I thought it was wicked of me not to love my sister so much that I wouldn't be a nun to help her. Arn once asked if I would not. Had I but said yes, then all this would not have happened." Lavrans shook his head. "Lie down now," he said. "You don't know what you are saying, poor child. Now you must try and see if you can sleep." But Kristin lay and felt the smart in her burnt hand, and despair and bitterness over her fate raged in her heart. No worse could have befallen her had she been the most sinful of women. Every one would believe. No, she could not bear to stay on here in the dale. Horror after horror rose before her when her mother came to know of this, and now there was blood between them and their parish priest, ill will betwixt all who had been friends around her the whole of her life. But the worst, the most crushing fear of all fell upon her when she thought of Simon, and how he had taken her and carried her away, and stood forth for her at home, and borne himself as though she were his own possession. Her father and mother had fallen aside before him, as though she belonged already more to him than to them. Then she thought of Arn's face in the coffin, cold and cruel. She remembered the last time she was at church. She had seen, as she left, an open grave that stood waiting for a dead man. The upthrown clods of earth lay upon the snow, hard and cold and grey like iron. To this had she brought Arn. All at once the thought came to her of a summer evening many years before. She was standing on the balcony of the loft room at Finnsbrecken, the same room where she had been struck down that night. Arn was playing ball with some boys in the courtyard below, and the ball was hit up to her in the balcony. She had held it behind her back, and would not give it up when Arne came after it. Then he had tried to wrest it from her by strength, and they had fought for it in the balcony, in the room amid the chests with the leather sacks, which hung there full of clothes, bumping their heads as they knocked against them in their frolic. They had laughed and struggled over that ball. And then, at last, the truth seemed to come home to her. He was dead and gone, and she should never again see his comely, fearless face, nor feel the touch of his warm, living hands. And she had been so childish and so heartless as never to give a thought to what must be for him, to lose her. She wept bitter tears, and she felt she had earned all her unhappiness. But then the thought came back of all that still awaited her, and she wept anew, for, after all, it seemed to her too hard a punishment. It was Simon who told Ranfried of what had happened in the corpse chamber at Brecon the night before. He did not make more of it than he had to. But Kristin was so mazed with sorrow and night-waking that she felt a senseless anger against him, because he talked as if it were not so dreadful a thing after all. Besides, it vexed her sorely that her father and mother let Simon behave as though he were master in the house. "And you, Simon? Surely you don't believe any of this?" asked Ranfried fearfully. "No," replied Simon. "Nor do I think there is any one who does believe it. They know you and her and this Benteen. But so little happens for folk to talk of in these out-parishes, it is but reason they should fall on to such a fat titbit. It is for us to teach them that Kristin's good name is too fine fare for such clowns as they. But it was a pity that she was so frightened by his attack that she didn't go straight away to you or to Sira Eirik with the tale. I think this bordel priest would but too gladly have admitted he meant nothing worse than harmless jesting, had you, Lavrans, got a word with him." Both Kristin's parents said that Simon was right in this, but she cried out, stamping her foot, "But he threw me on the ground, I say. I scarce know myself what he did or did not do. I was beside myself. I can remember nothing. For all I know, it may be, as Inga says. I have not been well or happy a single day since." Ranfried shrieked and clasped her hands together. Lavrans started up. Even Simon's face fell. He looked at her sharply, then went up to her and took her by the chin. Then he laughed. "Ha, ha, ha! God bless you, Kristin. You would have remembered only too well if he had done you any harm. It is no marvel if she has been sad and ill since that unhappy evening she had such an ugly fright. She has never known anything but kindness and goodwill before now," he said to the others. "Any but the evil-minded, who would rather think ill than good, can see by her eyes that she is a maid, and no woman." Kristin looked up into her betrothed's small, steady eyes. She half lifted her hands, as if to throw them around his neck, when he went on. "You must not think, Kristin, that you will not forget this. It is not in my mind that we should settle down at Formo as soon as we are wed, so that you would never leave the Dale. No one has the same hue of hair or mind in both rain and sunshine," said old King Sverre when he blamed his birch-legs for being overbearing in good fortune. Lavrans and Ranfried smiled. It was pleasant enough to hear the young man discourse with the air of a wise old bishop. Simon went on. "It is not for me to seek to teach you, who are to be my father-in-law. But so much maybe I may make bold to say. We, my brothers and sisters and I, were brought up more strictly. We were not allowed to run about so freely with the housefolk as I have seen that Kristin is used to. My mother often said that if one played with the Kotar Karl's brats, it was no surprise one would get a louse or two in one's hair in the end. And there is somewhat in that saying. Lavrans and Ranfrid held their peace. But Kristin turned away, and the wish she had felt but a moment before to clasp Simon around the neck had quite left her. Towards noon, Lavrans and Simon took their ski and went out to see to some snares up on the mountain ridges. The weather was fine outside, sunshine, and the cold not so great. Both men were glad to slip away from all the sadness and weeping at home, and so they went far, right up among the bare hilltops. They lay in the sun under a crag and drank and ate. Lavrans spoke a little of Arne. He had loved the boy so much. Simon chimed in, praised the dead lad, and said he thought it was not so strange that Kristin grieved for her foster-brother. Then Lavrans said, perhaps they should not press her too much, but should give her a little time to get back her peace of mind before they drank the betrothal ale. She had said somewhat of wishing to go into a convent for a time. Simon sat bolt upright and gave a long whistle. "You don't like the idea?" asked Lavrans. "No, but I do, said the other hastily. "I think it is the best way, father-in-law. Send her to the sisters in Oslo for a year. There she will learn how folk talk, one of the other, out in the world." "Ha! I know a little of some of the maidens who are there," he said, laughing. "They would not throw themselves down and die of grief if two mad yonkers tore each other to pieces for their sakes. Not that I would have such a one for wife, but I think Kristin will be none the worse for meeting new folks." Lavrans put the rest of the food into the wallet and said, without looking at the youth, "I think you love Kristin." Simon laughed a little and did not look at Lavrans. "You can be sure I know her worth, and yours too," he said quickly and shamefacedly, as he got up and took his ski. "I have met no one else that I would sooner wed with." A little before Easter, when there was still snow enough for sleighing down the dale, and the ice still bore on Majoz, Kristin journeyed southward for the second time. Simon came up to bear her company, so now she journeyed driving in a sleigh, well wrapped in furs, and with father and betrothed beside her. And after them followed her father's men and sledges with her clothes and gifts of food and furs for the abbess and the sisters of Nunnally.